The morning was barely awake when the gravel in the old shooting range parking lot shifted under the weight of slow, measured footsteps. Long before the sun began to spill across the jagged horizon of Arizona's red hills, a man stepped from the shade of the mesquite trees into the muted glow of the building's single floodlight. He moved without urgency, as if the world's clocks had little claim on him. His posture relaxed but deliberate, shoulders set as though carrying something heavier than the small worn canvas bag in his right hand. His clothes were unremarkable yet oddly exact. A flannel shirt washed so many times that its once vivid pattern had faded into sun-bleached earth tones, dark denim stiff with age, and a tan baseball cap with no badge, no team name, no statement. The brim shadowed his face so completely that the staffer behind the sign-in counter could not even describe his eyes later, only the square jaw with graying temples and the impression that he had been here before. He signed in under the simple alias K. Charles, left no ID, spoke no pleasantries, and counted out the cash fee with the same steady rhythm as his steps. The younger clerks called him the quiet guy at Lane 7 in whispered conversations over morning coffee, but to him those whispers never mattered. He neither confirmed nor denied their assumptions, never looking up as he pocketed his receipt and moved on, the sound of his boots soft and certain against the corridor's polished concrete. At that hour, the air inside the range was thick with a faint metallic tang of spent brass from days before, mingling with a hum of flickering fluorescent tubes that buzzed and dimmed in uneven patterns along the ceiling. Lane 7 was his destination every single visit, tucked away at the far end beyond the vending machine and beside the maintenance closet that smelled faintly of oil and cold steel. Most customers avoided that corner because the light was weaker there. The shadows stretched longer, and the silence seemed heavier than in the main bays. Yet to him, that shadowed lane was sanctuary. He set his gear on the pitted wooden bench with quiet reverence, as though the worn pistol case, the scuffed thermos, and the small cardboard box of ammunition were artifacts from another lifetime. There were no stickers on his bag, no personalized patches on his case, nothing flashy to mark him as a collector or enthusiast. Everything about him suggested purpose over presentation. With practiced hands, he unzipped the case and revealed a steel-gray 1911, the kind of sidearm that carried a history older than the hands that held it now. Its slide showed faint scarring from years of holstering, and its grip panels were worn smooth from repetition. He sat on the creaking plastic chair, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed downrange, but not on the target. The distant shadow seemed to hold something only he could see, as if he were recalling ghosts that lived in bullet scars rather than paper silhouettes. By the time the clock's red digits ticked to 7 a.m. sharp, the space behind him had shifted from empty to alive with distant footfalls, but he moved as if unaware. He loaded his magazine slowly, inserting 5 rounds with mechanical fluidity, slid the mag home, and stepped into his stance. His shooting style was not modern, not adorned with exaggerated angles or the sweeping theatrics of competitive marksmen. It was simple, squared, and patient, the stance of someone trained long before social media and highlight reels turned shooting into a performance. He drew a slow breath, exhaled, and let 3 rounds fly in rhythm so controlled they sounded like a heartbeat, then paused to feel the weight of the air before firing 2 more. When he lowered the weapon, the target in the dim distance revealed 5 holes so tightly grouped they could have been cut with a single punch. He did not smile. He did not nod to himself. He simply ejected the magazine, cleared the chamber with a soft click, and reset the rhythm as if the results meant nothing beyond the ritual itself. The few early risers on the range, scattered along the closer lanes, watched briefly and then turned back to their own work, thinking little of the quiet man at Lane 7. Yet an unspoken gravity had already begun to pool there, subtle as the first threads of sunlight creeping through the high windows, waiting for something or someone to disturb it. The morning quiet fractured when the heavy steel door to the range buzzed open with a sharp electric snap, cutting through the steady rhythm of shots from Lane 7. A burst of cold air rolled in, carrying with it a new energy. Boots stomped against the mat, duffel bags hit the floor, and voices tumbled over one another in loud, careless confidence. 6 young men spilled through the entrance, their uniforms loose enough to mark them as trainees. Not yet molded by the grind of deployment, but already carrying the posture of those who believed they had nothing left to prove. Their laughter echoed off the concrete walls, bouncing in jagged rhythms between the sound baffles and the metal stalls, the kind of sound that fills space without asking permission. They moved with a swagger that felt out of place in the dim light, as though the sterile corridor were a parade ground built solely for them. One of them, a broad-shouldered figure with a faded trident patch stitched to his sleeve, tossed his bag onto lane 5 with the easy arrogance of someone used to being the loudest presence in any room. He grinned wide enough to show every tooth and let his voice rise over the hum of the ventilation fans. "Place is dead today," he joked, chin tipping toward the far end where a lone man in a flannel shirt stood checking his weapon without so much as a glance in their direction. Another recruit snorted a laugh, muttering something about conspiracy theory bait shops and woodshop teachers, and the chorus of amusement rose again, unrestrained, unthinking, filling the room with heat that had nothing to do with the Arizona morning. They began unpacking their own firearms, sleek polymer frames with aftermarket sights, compensators, and grips that shone like polished trophies under the strip lights. The chatter shifted to calibers and recoil, mock arguments flaring up as easily as striking matches. One claimed his compact 9mm outperformed anything on the market. Another bragged that only a .45 had true stopping power, pounding his palm for emphasis. A third, younger than the rest, interrupted with a cocky grin. Real shooters don't blame the caliber. They just hit, earning him a round of shoulder punches and a few exaggerated whistles. Their voices rose and fell like waves, an endless tide of noise crashing against the back wall where Lane 7 waited in shadow. But through it all, the quiet man in the sun-faded flannel never turned his head. He loaded another magazine with unhurried precision, his hands moving with a stillness that made the clamor around him feel distant, almost unreal. His stance remained rooted, his breathing steady, and when he raised his pistol again, the range hushed for just a fraction of a second before the sharp rhythm of his shots cut through the air. 3 pause, 2 pause. Each round landed with surgical certainty, the reports echoing cleanly, not loud but pure, like a drumbeat keeping time in a room full of chaos. The recruits did not notice at first, too caught in their own noise, but one by one their ears began to tune to that rhythm, and their laughter stumbled, softened, as if something beneath their bravado had just shifted. Reggie, the one with the trident patch, was the first to notice. He leaned out slightly from his lane, his smirk faltering as his eyes narrowed toward the corner where the man in the flannel lowered his weapon with a movement so fluid it seemed rehearsed over decades. Reggie's own first 5 shots had been solid, tight enough to earn him grins and backslaps, but when his gaze fell on that distant target, his breath caught. Even from 15 yards away, even in the dim light, the holes were unmistakable. 5 shots through what looked like one ragged wound, center mass, no strays. His jaw flexed. He told himself it was luck, told himself it was just some old guy who got lucky with a warm-up string, but his grip on his Glock tightened just the same. Behind him, Petty, the youngest of the group, tilted his head to look as well, chewing his lip. "Think the old guy even knows what he's doing," he muttered, trying to sound amused but failing to hide the unease in his voice. Miles snorted softly, shaking his head. "Please, bet he loads 1 round at a time and says grace before each shot." Their laughter returned briefly, brittle this time, as though each of them needed the sound to push away the growing awareness creeping into their chests. Downrange, the man in flannel inserted another magazine with that same calm rhythm and prepared to fire again. The air around lane 7 seemed to thicken, quiet but charged, as if the concrete itself understood what the recruits had yet to grasp. They were not watching an amateur, not watching a hobbyist. They were watching someone whose silence held more weight than their loudest boast. Someone whose every movement carved out a lesson they were not ready to receive. And as the next 5 shots rang out, perfect, unhurried, absolute, none of them laughed. The soundscape of the range shifted like a tide turning. The recruits who had swaggered and full of bluster began to sense something they could not yet name. Keanu's rhythm was becoming impossible to ignore, each shot striking the paper silhouette with a precision that turned skepticism into unease. Reggie readjusted his stance at lane 5, squared his shoulders, and fired another string. His grouping was good, the kind that would earn nods in any class, but when his gaze slid sideways again toward lane 7, a sour taste crept into his mouth. 5 fresh holes had appeared where the old man's first group had been, except they had not spread, they had merged. The black center of the target was now a single torn crater, edges curled, paper fraying outward like the petals of a dead flower. Reggie's trigger finger froze mid-motion. He removed his ear protection and tilted his head, suddenly aware of the subtleties in the air. The faint smell of scorched paper carried back by the ventilation, the disciplined cadence of 3 shots followed by 2, a ritualistic pause that no civilian hobbyist would bother with. Petty stopped laughing. Miles's grin softened to a puzzled frown. The chatter about calibers and recoil thinned into silence as their ears started to tune to that sound. Crack, crack, crack. Pause. Crack, crack. It was not showy, not hurried, but each report sliced the space with surgical intent. Reggie had been taught that shooting was about control, but what he saw now was something beyond control, beyond drills. It was fluency, like listening to someone speak a language you barely understand but know is ancient and perfect. Petty leaned against the divider, brow furrowed. His own firearm momentarily forgotten. "I think he's using a 1911, he murmured, his voice low as if the man in flannel might hear him. Miles squinted downrange, following the line of smoke trailing faintly from the matte gray pistol. "That's old school," he said softly, and then, almost reluctantly, "heavy as hell, but smooth if you know what you're doing." Reggie, jaw tight, didn't respond. He knew his own weapon was top tier, knew his grouping was tight enough to impress any instructor, but something in his gut twisted as he replayed the rhythm in his head. That was not the tempo of a casual shooter. That was the tempo of someone who had fired under stress, not in sterile conditions but in places where mistakes cost more than pride. He felt the hairs on his arms lift. He squeezed off another string, faster this time, as if speed might restore the control slipping from his grasp. The impacts landed solidly but scattered just enough to gnaw at him. He cursed under his breath, not loudly enough for the others to hear, and stole another glance at lane 7. The man there hadn't changed expression, hadn't even shifted stance. He moved with the stillness of a mountain, the kind of stillness that was not absence of motion but presence of mastery. He ejected his magazine, checked the chamber, and reloaded with a calm that bordered on unnerving. Then came another cycle. 3 shots, pause, 2 more, each one threading through the same hole with a sound as precise as a metronome in a quiet room. The recruit's energy drained into a hushed tension that spread across the range like a slow leak. Their earlier arrogance began to collapse under the weight of something they had not expected. A lesson unfolding without a single word spoken. Petty swallowed hard, suddenly unsure whether to keep shooting or just watch. Miles fiddled with his gloves, eyes fixed on the distant figure. Even the others, Grant, Torres, and Lee, who had been exchanging jokes moments earlier, now stood quieter, their shoulders unconsciously straightening as though in the presence of someone they ought to respect. Reggie's smirk was gone entirely. He set his weapon down on the bench for a moment and stared at the silhouette downrange, at the single ragged hole that refused to grow no matter how many rounds the man in flannel sent through it. He could feel his heartbeat in his throat, a steady thump that matched the rhythm of those shots. Something about the man's stillness felt familiar yet unreachable, like the echo of a lesson he had once heard in training but never understood until now. Reggie muttered under his breath, almost a challenge to himself. No way, he's just some old hobbyist. But when the next set of 5 shots echoed, merging again into that impossible single tear, he felt something deeper than competition stir in his chest. It was the beginning of reverence, the first crack in the armor of youthful pride, and though he would not yet admit it, Reggie knew they were standing in the gravity of someone who had earned mastery the hard way. The range was no longer just a practice ground, it had become a classroom, and every shot from lane 7 was a lesson none of them would ever forget. Reggie felt the weight of his own reputation pressing on his shoulders as the rhythmic cracks from lane 7 continued, relentless and perfect. He had been the one to swagger through the door, to throw his bag down with a laugh, to brag about his groupings to the others. Now, every clean shot from that shadowed corner felt like a quiet dismantling of everything he thought he knew. He slid his ear protection off again, the sounds of the range sharpening instantly, the faint whir of the ventilation, the distant rattle of spent brass under someone's boots, and above it all the measured cadence of that pistol, each round striking with surgical inevitability. He clenched his jaw and stared at the silhouette downrange, the black paper riddled not with scattered impacts, but a single wound that grew no wider. His pride bristled, and something in his chest, something born of competition and the fear of being eclipsed, hardened. Without a word, he stepped back from his lane and let his boots carry him toward the end of the room, each footfall deliberate, echoing against the concrete like a slow drumbeat. Petty and Miles noticed instantly, their conversations dying mid-sentence as they watched Reggie move, unsure whether to follow or stay clear. When he stopped at the red line just behind lane 7, the old man in the flannel did not even look up. He was in the middle of a reload, hands moving with unhurried precision, the steel-gray 1911 balanced like an extension of his own body. Reggie cleared his throat, the sound oddly loud in the sudden hush. "Hey," he called, forcing casualness into his tone. "You any good with that thing, or just real consistent at pretending?" The man's hands paused only long enough to check the chamber before his eyes finally lifted. There was no heat in his gaze, no amusement, no visible pride. He simply looked at Reggie with calm, unblinking focus, the kind of look that stripped away posturing and left a person feeling seen. Reggie felt his own smirk falter but forced it back, raising his brows as though the moment meant nothing. "What do you say, old man?" he said, letting his voice rise just enough for the others to hear. "You up for a little challenge?" Behind him, Petty murmured a soft, "Oh, here we go," while Miles stifled a nervous laugh, both of them leaning just far enough out from their lanes to see. The others shifted, eyes narrowing, sensing something heavier than a joke unfolding in that shadowed corner. Reggie gestured toward the target downrange, then tapped the edge of his own lane divider. 5 shots, closest grouping. Let's see what you got." He waited for some kind of response, a scoff, a chuckle, anything, but the man simply tilted his head slightly, as though considering whether the question even mattered. Then, without a word, he reached into his bag and pulled out a fresh paper silhouette, unmarked and plain. He walked it downrange himself, boots silent on the concrete, clipped it to the rail with methodical care, and returned without meeting anyone's eyes. The silence stretched as he stepped back behind the red line, his expression unchanged, his movements as calm as before. He had not said yes, but he had not said no either. 'Twas enough. Reggie grinned tightly, the grin of a man trying to hold on to his own myth. He turned back to lane 5 and squared up, the weight of everyone's attention now pressing down on him. He could feel their eyes, the anticipation in the air, and the way the old man stood a few yards away, neither encouraging nor dismissing, simply waiting. Reggie loaded his Glock, took a long steadying breath, and fired his string. The shots were crisp, tight, and clean. 5 sharp reports that landed low left of the bullseye in a grouping he knew would impress any instructor. Petty whistled low. Miles slapped his shoulder. Even Reggie allowed himself a satisfied exhale. "Your turn, Flannel," he said, voice pitched loud enough to carry. The man at lane 7 did not answer. He stepped forward, raised the steel-gray 1911, and in 5 unhurried motions sent 5 rounds downrange. The sound was almost gentle compared to Reggie's shots, the rhythm the same as before, deliberate and calm. When he lowered the weapon and ejected the magazine, the recruits leaned as one toward the end of the range, eyes narrowing to see the target through the dim light. First no one spoke, then Petty's jaw went slack. The silhouette bore no 5-shot cluster, no scatter of marks. It bore a single ragged hole dead center, the edges curled inward like burned paper, all 5 bullets having passed through the exact same wound. Reggie blinked, his breath caught somewhere in his throat. His smirk gone without a trace. Behind him, the others were frozen, Their earlier grins and taunts dissolved into wide-eyed disbelief. The man in flannel holstered his weapon with the same unhurried calm, lifted his dented thermos for a quiet sip, and never said a word. In that moment, with the acrid scent of gunpowder hanging thick in the air and the soft hum of the lights overhead, every recruit in that room understood what Reggie could not bring himself to say. They were standing in the presence of someone who did not need to prove anything at all. The silence that followed was heavier than the concrete walls around them. Reggie stood rigid behind the red line, the Glock still in his hand, but suddenly feeling like a toy in comparison. His mind ran through excuses. Lucky grouping, trick target, some fluke in the paper. But none of them held weight under the sight of that single torn hole down range. The others behind him had gone quiet as well. Their earlier laughter dissolved into the kind of stunned stillness that only follows revelation. Petty's phone, half raised to capture the challenge, hung forgotten in midair. Its camera still blinking but no longer recording anything of value because the moment itself had outgrown technology. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed louder now. The distant rattle of casings being swept up by staff in the back, almost intrusive. Reggie swallowed hard, his throat dry. His pride shattered into pieces too small to gather. He looked at the man in flannel, at the calm set of his shoulders, the way he sat back on the worn plastic chair with elbows on his knees, the battered thermos cradled between his hands. There was no triumph in the man's eyes, no mockery, no hint of satisfaction. He simply existed there, as though this display of impossible skill was nothing more than routine maintenance, as ordinary to him as breathing. And that was the part that unsettled Reggie most. He had expected gloating or at least acknowledgement, but instead he was offered nothing but calm silence. It was not humiliation, it was something sharper. It was the realization that he was in the presence of someone who had already transcended the need for comparison. Reggie's jaw tightened as a new thought began to gnaw at him. He had seen shooters like this before. Not here, not in a civilian range, but in grainy footage during training, in whispered legends passed around late at night in the barracks. Men whose hands moved with unshakable calm, who could outshoot entire teams without breaking their breathing rhythm. Men who had done things far from home and never spoke of them again. He blinked, the shadows shifting as he watched the brim of that tan baseball cap tilt just enough for the light to catch the man's face. Recognition hit like a sudden jolt of electricity. The jawline, the streaks of gray at the temples, the eyes that carried the quiet weight of too many memories. He had seen that face before, not here, but on screens, in headlines, in stories that blurred the line between myth and man. His heart stuttered. He took a small step forward, whispering under his breath before he could stop himself. "That's Keanu Reeves." The words felt strange in the air, fragile, the almost sacred. Petty and Miles turned sharply, disbelief etched across their faces, but when they looked again, really looked, recognition dawned on them as well. This was not a movie poster version of the man, not the smiling Hollywood figure they had seen in interviews. This was something older, quieter, carved by time and experience. And suddenly every whispered joke about bait shops and conspiracy theories felt small and ugly. Keanu looked up, meeting Reggie's stunned stare with a single measured nod. He did not smile, he did not deny. He simply let the truth settle like dust in the charged air. Reggie felt the weight of that nod like a hand pressed against his chest. He wanted to say something, an apology, a question, anything to bridge the chasm between them, but no words came. Around him, the other recruits shifted, eyes wide. Expressions caught somewhere between awe and shame. The old man who had been invisible minutes ago was now something else entirely. A living testament to mastery earned in silence. Keanu stood, his movements as unhurried as before, and began to reload with the same methodical grace, sliding fresh rounds into the magazine without fanfare. The sound of each bullet clicking into place was louder than Reggie's heartbeat. When Keanu stepped forward again and fired another series, crack, 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 each round slipped through the same ragged opening until the silhouette on the target looked less like paper and more like an open wound in the shape of perfection. No one dared to speak. Petty lowered his own weapon, suddenly self-conscious about the tremor in his grip. Miles exhaled slowly, a breath that sounded like reverence, and Reggie, still frozen behind the red line, felt something shift deep inside. A dawning respect that humbled him in a way no instructor, no drill sergeant, no qualification test ever had. This wasn't about a challenge anymore. It wasn't about who was better. It was about witnessing the kind of skill and discipline that silences ego without ever raising a voice. Lane 7 was no longer just another stall in a dimly lit range. In that moment, it became sacred ground. A place where a man who owed no one an explanation reminded them all that true mastery does not shout. It simply shows up, quietly, and does the work. The smell of burnt gunpowder lingered in the air long after the last round was fired, settling into the porous concrete and hanging like a ghost over the range. Keanu Reeves, still seated at lane 7, rested his elbows on his knees and cradled the dented thermos in his hands. He stared downrange, not at the shredded target, but past it, into some distance no one else in the room could see. Around him, the recruits remained where they stood, weapons lowered. Their earlier cockiness dissolved into silence, so profound it seemed to soften even the hum of the overhead lights. Petty finally holstered his pistol, fingers shaking slightly, and took a half-step toward the bench as though drawn by something magnetic. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, uncertain and reverent. "Sir, we looked you up." The words floated in the air like a confession, and for the first time that morning, Keanu moved his gaze. He met Petty's eyes, the shadow of the brim no longer hiding the depth in his expression. "You saved a lot of people," Petty continued, his throat tightening, emotion cracking through the practiced bravado of a trainee. Keanu's answer was soft and without pride, almost gentle in the way truth can be. "They saved each other." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Petty nodded, lips pressed tight, then stepped back, lowering his head as though stepping out of a chapel. One by one, the others approached, each with their own silence, each with something in their eyes that hadn't been there when they first swaggered in. Miles came next, his usual smirk gone, replaced by a quiet that spoke of reflection rather than competition. He did not speak at all, just looked at the man in flannel, then down at the pistol in his own hand, and then back at the lane 7 target with a slow shake of his head. Grant followed, and then Torres, their footfalls soft as they moved across the range, stopping just short of the red line that marked where observation ended and sacred ground began. None of them asked for tips or bragged about their previous scores. They stood in respectful distance, absorbing the rhythm of the man who had silenced them with nothing more than the truth of his actions. Even the staff behind the glass leaned forward now, arms resting on the counter, eyes fixed on the figure they had once dismissed as a routine visitor. The instructors, hardened by years of training others, exchanged glances that carried a rare acknowledgement. There was nothing to teach here. They, too, became students in that quiet moment. And through it all, Keanu never raised his voice, never invited the attention, never claimed ownership of the lesson being learned. He simply existed in it, steady and present, the same rhythm guiding every movement. Reggie waited until the others had stepped back before he moved forward, the heavy weight of realization pulling at his shoulders with each step. He did not feel like the confident man who had strutted in hours before. He felt like a child who had just discovered that the world was larger than he could comprehend. He stopped just behind the red line, mirroring Keanu's posture without even meaning to, elbows resting on his knees, head tilted slightly as if seeing the target with new eyes. For a long moment he said nothing. The silence stretched, not awkward but dense with everything he wanted to say. When his words finally came, they were low and steady. "Do you ever think about teaching for real?" Keanu inhaled slowly, a breath that sounded like memory and distance combined. His answer was quiet, almost reluctant, yet perfectly clear. "I spent years," he said, "trying to forget everything I'd teach." Reggie felt the sting of that truth, felt it resonate with everything he had just witnessed, and nodded. He understood without needing more explanation. Some lessons could never be printed in manuals or recited in classrooms. Some were absorbed only in moments like this, quietly, without pretense. Keanu glanced at him, the faintest curve of a near smile crossing his lips. "Then don't talk so much," he murmured. For the first time that day, Reggie let out a genuine laugh, soft, brief, and stripped of ego. In that instant, every man in the room understood that something deeper than skill had been shared in Lane 7. It was not just a display of marksmanship. It was a reminder of how to carry yourself when no one is watching, how mastery is proven not by volume but by presence, and how respect, once earned in silence, never needs to be spoken aloud. The following Monday, the parking lot gravel shifted under those same measured boots again, but the atmosphere inside the range was different. It was 6:44 a.m., and the first traces of dawn had only begun to brush the horizon, yet the main bays were already half full. Regular shooters who normally claimed the central lanes had moved aside without being asked, their gear set up in quieter corners, their conversations subdued. There was no music playing from anyone's phone, no idle arguments about calibers or attachments. Even the ventilation hum seemed more pronounced against the hush. Lane 7 stood waiting, polished and empty, as though the space itself had been expecting him. Behind the front desk, the clerk who used to barely glance up now straightened, giving a small respectful nod as the man in flannel approached. Keanu returned it with only the briefest tilt of his chin, his expression unchanged, his pace steady. He signed the logbook with the same name, K. Charles, and counted out his cash with the same measured rhythm as before. But this time, when he turned toward the corridor, no one saw him as a mystery anymore. Heads lifted as he passed, not in curiosity but in recognition, eyes following him down the shadowed path toward the far end of the range. The gravelly scrape of his boots against concrete felt almost ceremonial. He reached Lane 7 and set his gear down in its familiar order. Pistol case, ammo, thermos, folded rag. There was no flourish, no difference in his ritual. And yet, when his hand brushed against the wooden partition, he felt the cool edges of a new brass plaque screwed neatly into place. It bore no name, no elaborate inscription, just a simple line, reserved until he says otherwise. Keanu said nothing as he began his preparations, but the recruits who had once mocked him were already there, standing a few feet behind the red line like students waiting for class to begin. Reggie was among them, shoulders squared yet humble now, holding a fresh box of .45 ACP rounds in both hands. He waited until Keanu finished his first magazine before stepping forward just enough to offer the box. His voice slow and steady. "I figured 30 wasn't enough today." Keanu paused, the weight of the box in Reggie's hands caught in his periphery, and for a moment he looked up. Their eyes met, Reggie's filled with a quiet respect. Keanu's reflecting something harder to name, a faint acknowledgement that went beyond words. He gave a single nod, longer than the subtle tilts he'd given before, and set the box gently on the bench beside his gear. Reggie stepped back without another word, the others following his lead, and together they watched. Keanu loaded his magazine with the same methodical grace, his fingers moving with rhythm and intent, and raised the pistol once more. 3 shots, pause, 2 shots, pause. The cadence was unchanged, but the air around it had shifted. Every report carried not just precision but something like instruction, a lesson without language. Even the instructors near the front had stopped correcting their own students, instead leaning subtly to watch Lane 7 as though they, too, were learning something that could not be written down. The brass casings clinked softly against the concrete, rolling in small arcs before settling near the boots of the men who now stood silent. As the hours passed, the younger recruits began to move less like showmen and more like apprentices, their stances less exaggerated, their grips more thoughtful, their breathing matched to the rhythm they had unconsciously absorbed. Petty, who once cracked jokes about woodshop teachers, now stood quietly with his hands clasped behind his back, eyes tracing every movement of Keanu's hands. Miles adjusted his own posture to mirror the older man's, shoulders squared, breath steady. Even Grant, who had once been eager for quick drills and loud praise, now lingered in the quiet, firing fewer rounds but placing them with more care. Keanu remained silent through it all, his presence alone reshaping the room. When his final magazine clicked empty, He lowered the weapon and placed it on the bench, his shoulders relaxing slightly as he picked up the battered thermos. He took a long, slow sip, eyes still fixed on the distant lane as though reading a story only he could see. The recruits did not move. They did not speak. They simply watched, absorbing every unspoken lesson, that mastery is not loud, that respect is not demanded, and that true skill leaves behind echoes far quieter and far stronger than any boast. When Keanu finally stood to leave, he left the full box of ammunition untouched on the bench, a gesture so subtle it felt sacred. No one dared disturb it. Hours later, when the last shooter had gone and the range was silent once more, the light from the high windows fell across Lane 7, glinting off the brass plaque, and though no ceremony had been held, every person who had witnessed that morning carried the same unshakable truth with him. In a world addicted to noise, there was still power in a man who simply showed up, did the work, and let silence speak for him.